Today we're on our last week of this Bible study, this sermon series, as we look at the mysterious pathways of joy. We've looked at the pathway and how we find joy through grace and through adversity and through simplicity. And today we're going to be talking about how we find joy in the thin places. And that term, the thin places, comes out of the Celtic religion, where in the Celtic religion they talk about the fact that there are thin places in our world where that dividing line between heaven and earth is just so thin you can almost touch the divine. You can feel the divine presence in that moment. And so they say that there are places that are the thin places in our world. And we probably have experienced that in many ways. And we even find that in our Judeo-Christian scripture. We find these ideas of the thin places, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. You find it, especially in worship. That's where we see it the most. So you go in the Old Testament, and David would go into singing. If you remember when Saul was all upset and he started singing, try to calm him down, he would sort of find this place of joy, and then as he worshipped and started developing the temple, but as he would go into worship, he would experience this moment of joy. And so all through the Psalms, you see the word joy associated with worship as that thin space happened in the temple. But you also find in the book of the Revelation where, again, there's this temple scene, but the temple is in heaven, and the folks in the temple in heaven are sort of looking down as the people from earth are looking up. And it says that the prayers of the saints become the incense of the worship that's happening in the temple in heaven. And so suddenly there's a thin space between those two places. And so the Bible has quite a few references to that.
Mm-hmm. And that's really the understanding of, well, especially traditional worship, because in traditional worship you process in and you have prayers and you have songs, and it's that idea that it's almost a rehearsal in a way of processing into the throne room of God that's in Revelation, and then what we are doing is filtering its way up through that thin place into the presence of God. And so we are worshiping God as we worship here.
And we also, though, sometimes experience those thin spaces in ways that we didn't see coming. One of my favorite is that of the story of C.S. Lewis. And Jim, I know C.S. Lewis has been somebody that you've loved to read for decades. So tell us a little bit about how Lewis experienced some of those thin spaces, how it changed his life.
Yeah, it's a really amazing sort of story that his thin place, as you would say it, started as a child. He had this land he created with animals that he called boxen. And so during that time, he would be creating that, enjoying that. He felt this sense, this something in his life that he said that the rest of his life he tried to recapture that through many different things. And so really as a child, through this imagination with these animals, which in turn then later in life would turn out to be, I think, really had a lot to do with the Chronicles of Narnia. From that he tried to recapture that sense of joy that he had as a child. So he went through many different things in his life, experimenting and looking into different things. And then finally, when he was older, he says actually he was walking, he actually became a Christian by walking to the zoo one day with his brother. He said, when I walked to the zoo, I wasn't a Christian, but when I returned, I was. And so really in his life, as smart as he was in things, his thin place happened as a child.
Well, and what I love, of course, I love Lewis as well, and always in the Chronicles of Narnia, when the Pavinsky children make their way back to Narnia, there's this moment of joy and surprise, because it happens, they don't control it.
Right.
And all of a sudden
They never know.
drawn into it.
Right.
And so they're drawn in, and then there's always this moment, oh my goodness, we're back. And you can almost see their faces just sort of shining as once again that thin space happened, and they experienced again joy as a result of experiencing God's world, as it were, in Narnia.
Right.
So we also experienced some of that with our holy days. And of course, we're pastors, so the holy days for us mean quite a bit. And for me, of course, All Saints its history goes back to, well, the word Halloween means All Hallows Day,
Right.
or All Hallows Evening, and that's the day before All Saints Day, which goes back to, again, some of those pre-Christian days. But the church sort of reclaimed that, and so I know All Saints Day is a big day in your life too, Bill. I mean,
absolutely.
you love that piece of it as we lead worship.
Absolutely. When you remember the saints that have gone to be with God, not just those in the previous year, but also it's so special for me when we light the one candle or ring the one bell that is for all the saints that have gone before, because it's that understanding that while we worship here, they worship there. Mm-hmm. We worship here, they worship truly in the presence of God. And on that day, it just feels like heaven and earth compressed together as we give God thanks for those that have gone before us.
Yeah, and of course, Easter, I mean, can't get away from Easter and the
Right.
reality that the presence of God suddenly, Christ has returned and the Spirit's there. And in Pentecost, all of a sudden, that thin space happened because now the Spirit is everywhere and is with us. And so,
Right.
so the holy days become those moments that we get that.
And Christmas Eve, there's that moment in Christmas Eve worship, especially in that moment when we raise the candles at the end of our service. It's just powerful. But just Christmas Eve, all that's involved there, the idea of how on that night the thin place really was torn, because on that night you have God, the Son of God, leaving the eternity of heaven and taking on the form of a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger in Bethlehem. And so it's everything, the thin place, it becomes even thinner, because God comes and is among us.
And then we sing "Joy to the World" as an awareness that, wow, this is something we don't control, but suddenly, once again, joy found us,
Right.
in the form of a small child,
Right.
and the Son of God. So so those holy days happen, and then, but there's also moments that are just almost coincidental, kind of like Lewis, where we just all of a sudden become aware that there's a pattern here that we don't control, and we're aware that God is doing something in the midst of that pattern. Anybody had an experience somewhat like that?
I did. When I was at the University of Kentucky, did not go into the university thinking about going into the ministry, but got involved with the Wesley Foundation there. And while I was at the Wesley Foundation, got involved with music with it and other things, and became actually the student associate minister, which is pretty neat. During my senior year, my home church in Lexington called me and said, "Jim, our youth minister just left and we have nobody. Could you please come and fill in for about 3 months for us?" And so I said yes. And so when I went to do, and I started that job there, I don't know how to explain to you the joy.
Yeah.
There was something that just happened. I never felt as comfortable in a place as I've been. And I knew from that moment on that I had found what God was calling me to do. There was this sense of joy that I've never regretted since that day.
Right.
So if somebody had told you from the beginning, why don't you go become a minister, you'd have probably said, "Oh, no, not in the world." But through that series of coincidences, God was at work, and suddenly you discovered through those thin spaces
Exactly
what was going on. So another place I think we experience those thin places, surprising kind of places with joy, are places in nature, or places where we just walk up on this scene, this moment, and we're just kind of overtaken.
Yeah.
I think back of going to Yosemite for the first time. It's like, oh my goodness, this is. I think someone else told me this is where God vacations. And it's like I can see that. It's just, this is an amazing place. I'm sure y'all have had similar kind of experiences in different places.
Yeah. Every time that Jim and I lead a group to the Holy Land, we always we land in Tel Aviv. We get on our charter bus and we go to Tiberias, and we're there in time to eat supper and go to bed. And there's something though, and I always try to tell the group to do it, because on that next morning when it's sunrise and your internal clock's a little thrown off because of time change, you're up anyway. But to step out on your balcony off of your room, or to go out to the back area of the hotel and to watch the sun come up over the Sea of Galilee, and watch the fishermen start coming in from where they'd been out fishing all night, just like in the biblical story. that's one of those moments of thin places where you feel the presence of God, but also you feel yourself almost in the biblical story, because suddenly you are there watching the sunrise on the Sea of Galilee, just like Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, and Jesus did. And it truly is an amazing, amazing moment.
And those moments happen, again, going back to, he called his biography Surprised by Joy. They just joy finds us, and
Right.
it's a mysterious pathway that it kind of finds us and grabs us. I think there's a lot of people, when couples get married, if one of them, usually the husband, has had a history of hunting or fishing, it's kind of frustrating because it's been all their time out there, but I think all of us have been in the woods at times in those moments where, but that's where all of a sudden there is this experience of peace and joy that you can't really describe. As something unusual happens, or an animal comes by, or something that sort of reminds us of God's presence in the midst of that.
I can remember we have a hiking group here at the church, and back we did our very first trip to the Grand Canyon. And I will never forget walking onto the North Rim the very first time, and you look out over there. There is this sense of awe, of joy, of whatever else, where you're just taken in by God. You just look at this and say, this is one of the most wonderful things. And no matter how much you've already seen it or seen pictures, until you, just like in the Sea of Galilee, that first night when we get up there, you get those chills and all. This Grand Canyon, when you're on that rim of the Grand Canyon, you look out upon that, of what God has created and all. You have that sense, and that's another, I think it's another thin place where that joy comes in.
And there's also moments, I think we probably I've had in art, where we look at a painting or a sculpture, and I'm not that artistic of a person, but I remember there was a moment in seminary where I was at Crown Plaza in Kansas City, and of course, seminary don't have the money to, don't have two quarters to rub together. But I was going through that beautiful area, and I ran across this piece of art of two hands with a lump that were flesh-colored, and in the hands were a black lump of clay, and just reminded of how, for me, it's like God spoke, and there was a moment of joy to realize I'm that lump of clay, and there's all kind of possibilities that God could do with that.
Yeah.
And I wished I had the money to buy it. Simplicity, as we learned a couple of weeks ago, didn't allow that. But anyway,
Right.
it was just very, very interesting possibility. So I think we've all had those moments in musicals, plays, that kind of thing, where God has spoken to us.
Yeah. I think the challenge, though, with this is allowing yourself to pause in the thin place, because it's really easy to be too busy doing other things to actually stop and to stand and watch the sunrise over the Sea of Galilee, because we have an itinerary we have of things we need to get done that day, or to spend the moment out in the woods or on the lake where you're there to hunt, you're there to fish or whatever, but to stop and to look around you and to take in what God is doing as a new day begins, or even in those moments when you're holding your child and you realize the blessing that's in this little baby and what God can do here, or to pause at a piece of art. I mean, sometimes we rush ourselves past the thin places when God is trying to get our attention and to bring joy into our life.
Sometimes it's other people who are getting your attention. I just been here maybe a year or so. One of our church members on a Wednesday evening when we're busy as can be says, "Jim, I need you to come out here with me." And I said, "Okay." I went out with her, and we went outside, and we just stood there. And I said, "So what do you need?" She said, "Nothing. I just wanted you to enjoy this sunset with me."
And so I think we learn, and hopefully we can all become aware of those moments when God, in that mysterious way, helps us find joy in some of the thin places of earth.
Absolutely.